The garden was prepared like a dream, trimmed hedges standing in perfect lines, white roses blooming along the stone path, and silk ribbons fluttering softly in the warm afternoon breeze. It was meant to be a celebration of union and honor, yet tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. Guests gathered in elegant attire, whispering behind gloved hands, all eyes drawn toward the center where the Duke stood. He was tall, composed, and distant, a man whose reputation carried both admiration and fear. Beside him stood the chosen bride, the beautiful daughter, adorned in fine silk and confidence, her smile practiced and flawless. A step behind, almost invisible, stood the other girl, the rejected one, her simple dress pale beside the splendor around her, her eyes lowered, her presence barely acknowledged by anyone except fate. She had learned long ago how to be unseen. In the household she grew up in, silence had been her armor. Since her mother's death, the world had shifted sharply, leaving her at the mercy of a woman who wore elegance like a weapon. Her stepmother ruled the house with sharp words and sharper expectations, and affection was reserved only for her own child. The rejected girl had grown accustomed to watching from corners, listening instead of speaking, enduring instead of resisting. Today was no different, or so she believed, until destiny decided otherwise. The ceremony had not yet begun when the stepmother approached, her heels clicking against the stone with deliberate force. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with something dark. She stopped directly in front of the quiet girl, blocking her from the view of the guests. A few nearby conversations faded, sensing tension, though no one dared intervene. The stepmother's voice cut through the air, low but venomous, accusing her of standing improperly, of daring to exist where she did not belong. Before the girl could speak, before she could even lift her eyes, the slap came. It echoed sharply across the garden, a sound far louder than any spoken insult. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The girl staggered slightly, her cheek burning, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She did not cry out. She never did. Her head bowed instinctively, not in guilt but in survival. The stepmother straightened, satisfied, as though she had corrected a flaw in the scenery. To her, this humiliation was routine, a reminder of place and worth. What she did not expect was the sudden shift in the air, the way silence deepened into something heavy and dangerous. The Duke had turned, his calm expression fractured for the first time, replaced by a sharp intensity that startled everyone present. He stepped forward, placing himself between the stepmother and the girl. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled but cold, demanding an explanation. The stepmother faltered, only briefly, before offering a polished excuse about discipline and disgrace. She gestured toward the girl as if she were nothing more than an object that had offended her. The Duke did not accept the explanation. His gaze moved past the stepmother, resting on the girl's face. He saw the red mark on her cheek, the way her hands trembled as she clasped them together, the quiet dignity with which she endured pain without protest. In that moment, something shifted inside him. He had come prepared to choose beauty and advantage, to fulfill an alliance that benefited his title and estate. Yet standing before him was a truth far more compelling than appearances. He asked her name. The question surprised her so deeply that she hesitated, and used to being addressed directly by someone of his standing. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. The sound of it carried across the silent garden, and the Duke listened as though it mattered. The stepsister's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face, while the stepmother stiffened, sensing control slipping from her grasp. The Duke turned to the guests and announced a pause in the ceremony. Murmurs erupted, shock and disbelief spreading quickly. No one understood what was happening, yet no one dared challenge him. He offered his hand to the rejected girl, not as a command, but as an invitation. She stared at it, uncertain, fear and disbelief warring within her. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The contact was brief but grounding, a silent promise of protection she had never known. As they stepped away together, the garden seemed to hold its breath. The stepmother's face darkened with fury, her carefully maintained composure cracking. The stepsister watched in stunned silence, her perfect future suddenly uncertain. For the first time in her life, the rejected girl was not following, not hiding, not enduring. She was being chosen, not for beauty or obedience, but for a strength no one had bothered to see. That day, the slap meant to shame her became the spark that changed everything. The girl did not yet understand the path opening before her, nor the trials that awaited, but as she walked beside the Duke, she felt something unfamiliar rise within her chest. Hope, fragile and dangerous, whispered that perhaps she was no longer invisible. The walk away from the garden felt unreal, as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis and left her struggling to keep balance. Guests stared openly now, whispers no longer hidden, but the Duke did not slow his pace. He led her through the tall iron gates and into the quiet gravel path beyond, where the sounds of the ceremony faded into a distant echo. Only when they were far enough away did he release her hand. She stood there, heart pounding, unsure whether to bow, apologize, or flee. Old habits urged her to lower her head and accept blame, even when she did not understand the crime. "You are not in trouble," the Duke said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was calmer now, stripped of the sharp authority he had shown moments earlier. "No one has the right to strike you." The word struck her more deeply than the slap had. No one had ever said that to her before. She swallowed, her throat tight, and nodded without looking up. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable yet not unkind. Finally, she lifted her eyes just enough to meet his gaze. There was no judgment there, only curiosity and something else she could not name. He asked her to walk with him, not as a command but as a request. Together they moved along the path, passing rows of old trees whose branches formed a natural arch overhead. The Duke spoke of the estate, of the expectations placed upon him since childhood, of how every decision he made was weighed for its usefulness rather than its truth. She listened, surprised by the openness of a man she had always imagined distant and untouchable. When he asked about her life, she hesitated, then offered careful fragments, speaking of books read in hidden corners, of long hours spent learning quietly while others were praised. She did not speak of cruelty directly, yet every word carried its shadow. By the time they returned, the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky. The estate was in chaos. Servants hurried back and forth, unsure whose orders to follow. The stepmother stood rigid near the entrance, her expression tightly controlled, while the stepsister hovered beside her, eyes darting anxiously. The moment they saw the Duke return with the rejected girl at his side, the tension sharpened. The Duke addressed the household firmly. He announced that the ceremony was postponed and that he would remain at the estate as a guest until further notice. The declaration alone was shocking, but what followed left everyone breathless. He stated clearly that any mistreatment he had witnessed would not be tolerated under his presence. His gaze settled briefly on the stepmother, whose lips thinned as she forced a smile of compliance. That night, the rejected girl was given a room of her own, one that overlooked the gardens she had never been allowed to walk freely. The space felt foreign, almost overwhelming. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for someone to come and tell her it was all a mistake. No one did. Instead, a maid arrived with warm water and clean linens, treating her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. Sleep did not come easily. Memories replayed relentlessly, the slap echoing in her mind, followed by the Duke's intervention. For years, she had believed endurance was her only strength. Now someone had seen something else in her, something worth defending. The realization frightened her more than the pain ever had. Morning brought new unease. At breakfast, she was invited to sit at the main table. The stepmother watched every movement closely, her smile fixed but her eyes cold. The stepsister avoided her gaze altogether. Conversation was strained, each word chosen carefully, as though the wrong phrase might shatter the fragile calm. The Duke treated her with quiet respect, asking her opinion, listening when she spoke, never raising his voice. With each passing moment, the balance of power shifted further from what it had once been. Later that day, the Duke requested to speak with her alone. They met in the library, a vast room filled with towering shelves and the scent of old paper. He told her of his intention to choose a bride not for advantage, but for character. He admitted he did not yet know what that choice would be, only that he refused to ignore what he had witnessed. His honesty left her unsettled. She had never been asked to be anything more than obedient. Now, the possibility of choice hovered before her, like an open door she did not know how to cross. As days passed, subtle changes unfolded. The stepmother's authority weakened under the Duke's watchful presence. Sharp words turned cautious, punishments delayed or abandoned entirely. The rejected girl found herself allowed small freedoms she had never known: walks in the garden, access to the library, moments of quiet without fear. Yet with each kindness came anxiety. She waited for the cost, certain that safety could not last. One evening, she overheard raised voices behind closed doors. The stepmother argued fiercely, accusing the Duke of disrupting plans carefully laid, of favoring weakness over beauty and alliance. His reply was firm and final. He spoke of dignity, of injustice, of how cruelty revealed more about the one who inflicted it than the one who endured it. The words settled deep within her, strengthening something fragile but growing inside her heart. That night, standing alone by the window, she realized her life had already changed beyond recognition. The slap that once defined her humiliation had instead exposed a truth no one could ignore. She was no longer invisible, and whether she was ready or not, the world was beginning to see her. The change did not happen all at once, but in quiet, undeniable ways that slowly reshaped the household. Servants who once ignored her presence now greeted her respectfully. Doors that had always been closed to her were suddenly open. Yet the most difficult change was within herself. She moved through each day with cautious steps, half expecting the ground to vanish beneath her feet. Kindness still felt like a trick, something borrowed rather than owned. The Duke began spending more time at the estate, often inviting her to join him for walks or conversations that stretched longer than she anticipated. At first, she spoke little, answering questions simply, carefully. But he never rushed her, never filled the silence with impatience. Gradually, words came more easily. She spoke of books she loved, of stories where quiet strength triumphed over cruelty, of dreams she had never dared to name aloud. He listened as though each thought mattered, as though her inner world held value. The stepmother watched these interactions with growing resentment. Her smiles became sharper, her politeness brittle. She began to whisper to guests and relatives, weaving stories that painted herself as misunderstood and the girl as manipulative. Yet her influence weakened with each passing day. The Duke's presence acted as a shield, and his reputation ensured that her whispers did not travel far. For the first time, the stepmother faced consequences she could not easily control. The stepsister, once confident and admired, struggled with the sudden shift in attention. She had been raised to believe beauty guaranteed devotion and obedience secured reward. Now, she found herself overlooked, her practiced charm failing to capture the Duke's interest. Frustration replaced confidence, and her glances toward the rejected girl grew sharper, tinged with envy and disbelief. She could not understand how someone she had always dismissed now stood at the center of everything she wanted. One afternoon, the Duke invited the girl to ride with him across the outer fields of the estate. The wide open space frightened her at first, and used as she was to freedom without supervision. Yet as the horse moved steadily beneath her, guided by his calm instruction, fear slowly gave way to exhilaration. The wind brushed her face, carrying with it a sense of possibility she had never known. Laughter escaped her lips before she could stop it, surprising both of them. The Duke smiled, not at her appearance, but at her joy. That moment lingered with her long after the ride ended. She began to realize that strength did not always mean enduring pain in silence. Sometimes, it meant allowing herself to feel happiness without apology. This understanding was fragile, easily shaken, but it grew with each new experience. The turning point came during a formal dinner held to reassure distant relatives that order remained intact. The table glittered with polished silver and candlelight, conversation flowing carefully around unspoken tension. Halfway through the meal, the stepmother rose, her voice smooth and calculated. She spoke of family unity, of sacrifice, of how appearances could deceive. Her words were veiled, but their target was clear. The room fell quiet as her gaze fixed on the rejected girl, daring her to respond. Before fear could silence her, the Duke spoke. His tone was calm, but it carried undeniable authority. He addressed the room, speaking openly of character, of integrity, of the quiet strength he had observed during his stay. He described cruelty not as discipline, but as weakness disguised by power. Each word dismantled the stepmother's carefully constructed image. Faces around the table shifted, understanding dawning where ignorance once stood. The stepmother attempted to interrupt, but the Duke did not allow it. He made it clear that any union he entered would be founded on respect, not convenience. Then, with deliberate clarity, he announced his intention to court the rejected girl openly. The declaration sent a shock through the room. Gasps echoed, cutlery stilled, and every gaze turned toward her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Old instincts screamed at her to retreat, to deny worth, to apologize for existing. But something stronger held her in place. She lifted her head and met the room's gaze. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke, yet did not break. She thanked the Duke for his honesty and acknowledged the uncertainty of the future. She did not beg for acceptance or plead for mercy. She simply stood, present and unashamed. That night, she cried alone in her room, overwhelmed by everything she had held back for so long. Tears fell not from pain, but from release. Years of silence poured out, leaving behind a fragile sense of peace. She understood now that being chosen did not erase her past, but it allowed her to redefine it. In the days that followed, preparations began quietly, without grand announcements or forced celebrations. The Duke treated her not as a possession, but as a partner in thought and choice. He asked her opinions, respected her boundaries, and encouraged her growth. For the first time, she was allowed to become more than what others had decided for her. The stepmother's power faded completely when relatives withdrew support, unwilling to align themselves with exposed cruelty. She retreated into bitterness, her influence reduced to sharp glances and hollow words. The stepsister withdrew as well, forced to confront a reality where beauty alone no longer secured devotion. As the season shifted, so did the girl's understanding of herself. She learned that courage could be quiet, that dignity could survive even the deepest wounds, and that love did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it came softly in the form of being seen. Standing once more in the garden where everything had begun, she touched the place on her cheek where the slap had fallen. There was no pain there now, only memory. What had once marked her humiliation had instead marked her awakening. She was no longer the rejected one. She was a woman who had endured, grown, and finally stepped into a life that belonged to her. The announcement changed the rhythm of the estate completely. What had once been a place ruled by tension and quiet fear slowly transformed into one filled with cautious respect. The rejected girl, now openly courted by the Duke, found herself at the center of attention she had never sought. Every step she took felt watched, measured, and judged, not only by others but by herself. She feared making mistakes, feared that one wrong word might confirm every cruel belief once placed upon her. Yet the Duke remained steady, reminding her through actions rather than promises that she was not required to perform or pretend. He arranged for her education to continue openly, no longer hidden or treated as unnecessary. Tutors arrived, addressing her with courtesy, asking her thoughts instead of dismissing them. At first, she struggled to speak freely, her mind trained to remain silent. But slowly, knowledge awakened confidence. She began to realize how much she had absorbed over the years simply by observing, listening, and enduring. Intelligence that had once been ignored now found space to grow. The stepmother watched all of this unfold with restrained fury. She attempted subtle sabotage, correcting the girl publicly, questioning her suitability in polite tones, reminding everyone of her humble origins. But each attempt failed. The Duke responded not with anger, but with clarity, calmly dismantling every insinuation. With each failed effort, the stepmother's authority diminished further, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that she no longer controlled the narrative. The stepsister, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. Invitations once addressed to her now included the rejected girl's name first. Compliments that once flowed easily toward her beauty now shifted toward grace, intelligence, and resilience. She tried desperately to reclaim attention through charm and exaggeration, but desperation only highlighted insecurity. Resentment hardened within her, turning admiration into bitterness. One evening, unable to contain herself, the stepsister confronted the girl in the corridor outside the library. Her voice trembled with anger as she accused her of stealing a future that did not belong to her. The words struck deep, awakening old guilt and doubt. For a moment, the girl almost believed her. Almost. Then she remembered the slap, the silence, the years of being unseen. She answered calmly, not with accusation, but with truth. She spoke of survival, of never asking to be chosen, only wanting to be treated as human. The stepsister had no reply. She turned away, defeated not by cruelty, but by honesty. The Duke witnessed the change in her with quiet pride. He noticed how she carried herself differently, how her eyes no longer avoided contact, how her voice steadied even when uncertainty lingered beneath it. Their conversations deepened, shifting from shared experiences to shared values. They spoke of justice, of responsibility, of the kind of future they wished to build. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by fear. Yet growth did not erase pain overnight. Nightmares still came, memories surfacing without warning. Some days, kindness felt heavier than cruelty ever had because it demanded belief. On those days, the Duke did not push or question. He simply remained present, understanding that healing followed no strict path. His patience became the foundation upon which trust slowly formed. News of the Duke's choice spread beyond the estate, stirring both admiration and controversy. Some praised his integrity, while others criticized his rejection of tradition. Letters arrived questioning his judgment, warning of scandal. He answered none of them publicly. Instead, he focused on preparing her for the scrutiny that awaited. He taught her how to navigate courts and gatherings, not as someone pretending to belong, but as someone who did. Her first public appearance beside him was terrifying. The hall was filled with unfamiliar faces, sharp eyes, and polite smiles hiding curiosity. She felt every gaze upon her, weighing her worth. Her hands trembled until the Duke placed his arm beside hers, not possessively, but reassuringly. She breathed deeply and stepped forward. As the evening progressed, she spoke thoughtfully, listened carefully, and remained composed. By the end of the night, whispers had changed tone. Doubts softened into intrigue, intrigue into respect. The stepmother's downfall came quietly. Financial support once promised by relatives was withdrawn, alliances dissolved. Without influence or admiration, she retreated into bitterness. Her power reduced to memories of control she could no longer enforce. The household no longer feared her. Silence, once her weapon, became her prison. As weeks turned into months, the girl realized something profound. She was no longer living in reaction to pain. She was living in choice. Each decision she made, each step she took, belonged to her. The past still existed, but it no longer dictated her future. One afternoon, She returned alone to the garden where everything had begun. The roses bloomed again, just as they had on the day of the slap. She stood there, feeling neither anger nor sorrow, only clarity. What had once broken her had also revealed her strength. She understood now that her worth had never been absent, only ignored. When the Duke joined her, she did not flinch or hesitate. She met his gaze openly, equal to equal. Together, they looked toward a future shaped not by cruelty or appearance, but by understanding, resilience, and choice. The garden no longer held pain. It held proof that even the quietest souls could rise, and that being chosen sometimes began with choosing oneself. The final preparations unfolded without spectacle, yet every moment carried a quiet weight that neither of them ignored. The estate no longer felt like a battlefield or a prison. It had become something else entirely, a place reshaped by truth rather than fear. The rejected girl, once invisible within its walls, now walked its halls with steady steps. She was not flawless, not suddenly fearless, but she was real, and that was enough. On the morning of the Duke's final decision, the sky was clear, pale light spilling across the gardens. There would be no grand audience, no theatrical ceremony designed to impress. The Duke had insisted on simplicity, a choice that unsettled many but felt right to her. For years, her life had been shaped by performances forced upon her by others. She refused to begin her future the same way. She stood before a mirror, adjusting a modest gown chosen not for extravagance, but for comfort. As she looked at her reflection, memories surfaced uninvited. The girl who once avoided mirrors, who believed her face held no value, stared back at her. Yet something was different now. Her eyes no longer carried only endurance. They carried awareness. She understood who she was, not because someone had chosen her, but because she had survived without becoming cruel herself. The stepmother watched from a distance that morning, stripped of authority and certainty. Her words had long since lost their power. She attempted no final confrontation, no dramatic plea. Pride held her silent, but regret flickered briefly in her eyes, too late to repair what had been broken by years of cruelty. The stepsister did not attend at all, retreating from a reality she could not accept. Their absence felt symbolic, closing a chapter that had defined so much pain. The Duke met her beneath the old trees at the edge of the garden, the same path where they had once spoken as strangers. There were no vows recited for an audience, no applause, only honesty exchanged between two people who understood the cost of choice. He spoke of partnership, of respect, of walking beside her rather than ahead of her. He did not promise perfection or ease. He promised presence. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled slightly, but she did not lower her head. She spoke of fear, of learning to believe kindness without suspicion, of choosing courage even when doubt remained. She did not frame herself as grateful for rescue. She framed herself as willing to stand, to grow, and to build a future rooted in dignity. The Duke listened, and when she finished, he nodded, understanding that this union was not an ending, but a beginning. Life beyond the estate unfolded gradually. Court life was demanding, filled with unspoken rules and careful diplomacy. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed, when old instincts urged her to disappear into silence. Yet she did not retreat. She asked questions. She learned. She observed, just as she always had, but now observation became strategy rather than survival. Those who underestimated her soon discovered that quiet did not mean weak. There were challenges. Rumors surfaced, questioning her worth, her origins, her right to stand where she did. Some voices were loud, others subtle, but none were unfamiliar. She had lived with judgment her entire life. The difference now was choice. She chose which voices mattered. The Duke never shielded her from reality, but he never allowed disrespect to stand unchallenged. Together, they set boundaries that reshaped how others treated them both. In time, her compassion became her greatest strength. She advocated quietly for fairness within the Duke's lands, addressing injustices she recognized all too well. servants, workers, and those long ignored found in her an unexpected ally. Change did not come through dramatic decrees, but through consistent action. Respect replaced fear. Loyalty followed naturally. One evening, months later, she stood alone on a balcony overlooking the estate. Lanterns glowed softly below, laughter drifting upward from the courtyard. The sound did not trigger anxiety, as it once would have. It brought warmth instead. The Duke joined her, saying nothing, simply standing at her side. They had learned that silence did not always mean absence. Sometimes it meant understanding. She reflected on the slap that had once defined her humiliation. It no longer held power over her. It had become a marker, not of shame, but of transformation. Pain had revealed truth, and truth had opened a path she never imagined walking. She had not been chosen because she was perfect or beautiful. She had been chosen because she was whole, even when the world tried to break her. As the night deepened, she realized something quietly profound. Her story was no longer about rejection. It was about becoming. Becoming visible, becoming heard, becoming free. The girl who once stood silently behind others now stood firmly within her own life. Not rescued, not elevated by chance, but shaped by resilience and choice. And as she turned toward the future, she understood that her strength had always been there. The world had simply needed to see it, and she had finally allowed herself to believe it.